Tell me about some of the ideas that you're bringing forward in civilizing the economy and in articulating a new vision for how we might live together.
Okay. In Civilizing the Economy, I basically tell two stories, I think. One is a story, goes back, well, to John Locke, Adam Smith. And with Adam Smith, what I discovered is that he didn't tell us the truth. That in fact, the wealth he enjoyed was based on the tobacco trade, which was based on slavery. So that you really can't understand early capitalism without understanding slavery. But instead of that story, he tells us a story about the butcher and the baker and the invisible hand. I call this an economics of dissociation, which splits off the misery of the real providers of wealth, whether they're slaves or migrant workers or people in sweatshops, and then is optimistic about market conditions. And we live in that legacy. Well, what I discovered about Adam Smith is the reason he didn't, I think the reason he didn't tell us, is what I call an economics of property. That for him, slaves were property. They were things you could buy and sell. And I think he was really embedded in a particular view of human evolution, that we were first hunters and shepherds, and there was agriculture, farmers, and then commercial society. And these were stages for him of the development of property. And so the basic relations of commercial society were property relations. In fact, 1776 was when The Wealth of Nations was published, which was the same time as the American Revolution. And in a sense, that was a commercial revolution. It was about property owners, and only property owners could vote. And so I think we've lived in this legacy of an economics of property that treats people and the planet as a thing, as a commodity. And that just doesn't have a future in terms of justice, and particularly in terms of sustainability. So then, after I detail that story, I try to create a new story. At the center of the story is that all human communities have to do three things. They have to provide for one another, they have to protect one another, and they have to have social meaning. And economics, I think, is essentially about making provisions. It's the question of how do we provide for one another. And so I develop what I call an economics of provision. And the foundation of that economics of provision is not property relations, but human relations. And I think of human relations in this sense as civic relations, relationships among citizens.
So, Marvin, when you say human relations, that can mean so many different things to so many different people. What does it mean for you, and why is it important?
I think the basic difference is a contrast between ownership and membership. So what does it mean to say we're members of the civic? And I think that we're all members of the civic, and we're equal members. The definition I'm using now of the civic is that space that in between our social differences and our common humanity. And you find this space, say, in front of City Hall. There will be a civic center, right? And sometimes you'll find it in protest movements. But if you say, well, conceptually, where is it, right? Then I think it is this space between social differences. I mean, I'm white, I'm a WASP, etc., right? I'm male. Those are different than other people. So we all have these social differences. But I think we have a common humanity. And we participate in that common humanity. And when we start talking about how we're going to live together, that, I think, is when the civic emerges. It really emerges in these conversations.
When you say membership, as opposed to ownership. What do you mean by membership? Because membership can mean everything from belonging to a baseball club, but it could also be being a member of a political party. How is this membership fundamentally different than ownership, and why is that important?
Well, it's different than ownership because I think there is a sense of the commons. We belong to this. Ownership is about, what belongs to me, not what do I belong to. And membership's really about that I'm participating in something. To be a member is to be a part of something instead of to own something. So I think there's a difference between ownership and membership. Civic membership is certainly not the same as membership of families or other things. I think there is some civic norms. First of all, we're all equal members, so there's kind of a moral equality. Everyone has equal rights to whatever the system's providing us. And I think also kind of in almost every culture you have the concept of reciprocity. And I think reciprocity is one of the norms of the civic, which means, for example, let's say in terms of wages. Right now, if a person's working in the Dominican Republic, they're probably working, for the least amount someone has to pay them. They're spending their day working, but in exchange, they're getting not enough to raise their family or to feed their family. Reciprocity would be a moral foundation, and this is where a human foundation is different than a foundation based on property relations, that they should get enough to feed their family, to make a living. And that would put reciprocity as really a civic foundation for work relations instead of property relations.
When you say reciprocity, what are some types of reciprocity? What's an example for you of reciprocity in the civic space?
Well, there's kind of what I would call almost economic reciprocity, which is there should be a fair exchange. A good day's work should get a good day's pay, which should be enough to raise a family. That's reciprocity, right, in terms of wages, right? I think there's a reciprocity that if I participate in something, like the work situation, or in a community, I should have a right to have a say about the structure of that community, right? And so the very principle of democracy, in a sense, is based on reciprocity, that I should have a voice if I'm participating in something. There's even a reciprocity about a conversation, right? If I am in a conversation and it may not be me, it may be someone else who tells the truth, right? Says what's true. Well, reciprocity would mean that other people would recognize that and acknowledge that that's the truth, right? People wouldn't be shut out or people wouldn't be shut down. So it's really central, I think, to civic conversations to have kind of these moral norms of moral equality and reciprocity. And that's a foundation, I think, certainly for democracy.